the volume.
Yeah, but remember, it doesn't let you do it. Okay, we're live.
Doesn't let me do it. Welcome to From the Ground Up podcast. Thank you all for being here. First thing we want to talk about is we have our fundraiser shirts up. So I would love it if you would check out portcitypythons.com and we can raise some money for the OCIC. If you want to learn more about the OCIC and basically indigo snake conservation, please check out our podcast with the director, Michelle Hoffman. We did it a few weeks ago. So if you want to check out that, and please support us in supporting them. And I would really, really, really appreciate it.
And the shirts just look cool. I don't know. Also,
and just get yourself a shirt.
We've said this before, but if you got a shirt, please send us pictures. I think we've only gotten like one picture back. We just want to know what they look like in real life.
Well, Austin, last week's guest, had it on.
Yes,
so
true.
Triple points for Austin. Other than that, what else do we have?
Well, nothing. I mean, it doesn't affect them, but for us, we have officially completed all of our corn locks for this season, which is really, really exciting. Our biggest one is our het palmettos locked, and so we are super excited to sell palmettos this fall. 0 of our Cali Kings have gone, which is the flip side. That's very disappointing.
It's to the point where we have to resex all of them, basically, because we're like, are we even putting the right things together? That's how unsuccessful we are and how little interest anyone's taking in each other. So that's pretty much where that is. Louisiana pine snakes.
They made it happen, which is exciting. Our brooks have made it happen multiple times.
So lots of busyness, but we still got to do some more locks. And
yes. Also, thank you to anyone who we saw at the White Plains show this weekend. It was really exciting to be there. It was my first time at the White Plains show. It was just nice to see what he talks about all the time with the show.
Rating 1 out of 10.
What?
What would you rate the show?
It depends on its own or compared to others.
Well, obviously you got to take into account the others.
On its own, it's a different comparison, but compared to some other shows we've been to, it's a pretty good show. I mean, I don't know. I thought it was good. And also it's what are you judging it on? Are you judging it on cleanliness and all that? Cleanliness. It was great. The $15 parking lot, because I'm frugal.
That's what you're concerned about is the parking.
In addition to other things that I won't get into. But I think that is it for us.
Yes. So today we have on Melissa and Jeff from Advocates for Snake Preservation. So Melissa, Jeff, if you guys could introduce yourself and tell us a bit of what ASP does.
Sure. Do you want me to go first? So
sure.
I'm Melissa, and we co-founded Advocates for Snake Preservation, or ASP, very clever acronym. And we both worked in conservation in the field for, 12 years, looking at the effects of various human treatments on reptiles and amphibians, with a particular focus on snakes on most of our projects. And, we would be out there doing science stuff and tracking animals with radio telemetry. So lots of cool, obvious equipment. And because we were looking at the effects of urban development or fire in national parks, we'd often run into members of the public, and they would always come up and be like, oh, they're so interested in what are you guys doing with that cool stuff? And then we'd tell them, and they'd be like, snakes. And at best, kind of uninterested. And at worst, they're like, but why would we want to know? I mean, wouldn't it be better if that killed all the snakes? So we started to realize that there was this disconnect and this issue that wasn't really being addressed on a large scale of, their conservation scientists are collecting all these data on how we can help snakes. But if the public doesn't care, they're going to shut those projects down, especially when it's a potentially dangerous animal like a rattlesnake or some other venomous snake. They don't want to help them. So we decided to form this organization to address that issue, and basically a positive PR firm for snakes. We're trying to change the way people feel about snakes, people talk about snakes, and therefore how they treat snakes. So yeah.
Well, yeah. So that's the story. I'm Jeff. I'm just here to, listen like you guys. No, so we did meet, working on some conservation projects with reptiles, and like Melissa says, it's, it's easy for a scientist to think you're doing good work when you're out there, you're getting funding, you're publishing papers, but when the real, what really makes a difference is when snakes are made, have an easier time in the wild, because that's what we really want. And so there is a disconnect between, you write your reports, you write your paper, but then that has to be carried forward. There's a little bit of politics involved, and there can be an uproar when the general public is like, you want to do what with tax money? You want to set aside this land, or whatever it is, you want to study this animal. So like Melissa said, we want to show, both of us are like just enthralled with watching snakes, and it's just the coolest thing to be out there to see what they do, what they're all about in the field. We're both, we both fell in love with snakes early on, and reptiles in general, and so, but then we had the opportunity to kind of to track them around and figure out what they do a little bit in the wild. Where to find them, when they're active, and we both were just sort of like, oh my God, this is the most interesting thing we could do. When our friend, for 6 months of the year, when our friends were like, hey, let's go to the bar, or let's go to we're having a party, we'd be like, sorry, it's the field season. We'd be out every night following snakes around, because that was our life, So for us, it's the most fascinating thing to be out there watching these animals. And so, like Melissa said, when you come across people that are like, oh God, why would you, a snake is,
you're trying to figure out like how to bridge that, and, make it, not even, it doesn't have to be exciting. It's not like everybody has to be in love with them, but at least like not against them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it seems so innate. It seems like a gut reaction for a lot of people. So it's obviously very, very hard. It's a very vague question to be like, oh, well, how do we portray reptiles in a positive light, when it seems like a very complicated issue? So, I mean, in your opinion, how are you doing that? How are you trying to basically portray them in a positive light?
Yeah, it is a good question. And I think, a lot of the things that drew us all to snakes, and especially those who work with some of the venomous species like rattlesnakes. So snakes in general, it's like, they're these fierce, like amazing and effective predators. And most of us that keep snakes or enjoy watching snakes, like that's really exciting for us. I mean, I remember as a kid, watching it on TV. And then when I got my first snake, like, that whole predation thing was really exciting for me. And with venomous species and rattlesnakes in particular, it's like the rattling is really cool. And why do they do that? And venom is really neat. And in the way that they're most often portrayed on TV, it's like, who's the most dangerous? Who's what can they kill? How fast can they like drop an elephant? And to those of us who like snakes, none of those things are scary. They're just cool. But for people who are scared of snakes, like that, all of those things are turnoffs. Like they don't want, maybe they want to know who's dangerous, but it's mostly just so that they can figure out like who they should kill the fastest, or when they should call someone to get rid of it. And so for us, and it was kind of basically like listening to something on National Public Radio where they were talking about whales and how we need to save whales, which is that's kind of a joke now among environmentalists, like save the whales, but they didn't talk about whales as predators. They didn't talk about their important place in the ecosystem. What they talked about was whales have families, and whales have these social bonds, and all of these things that to basically every human, we can relate to those things. We have friends, we have parents that took care of us. We have families. We have family reunions. Like these all invoke positive emotions instead of negative emotions that snakes often evoke, like fear and hate. And at that same time that I heard that, we were just starting to learn about and to think about and observe social behaviors and parental care among rattlesnakes. And it's like, well, wait, why don't we talk about snakes that way? Like yeah, they're predators, and that's really interesting. And they are venomous, and venom is a very cool, like, evolutionary tool to be able to eat these large things, large and potentially dangerous prey. But also, rattlesnakes take care of their kids, and that is so cool, and something that, like, hardly any of the general public knows about. And when they find out about it, like, just to see the change in people's minds, it's like, now this isn't necessarily like just a cold-blooded killing machine, is a mom or somebody's friend. And so that's what we focus on in our education and outreach efforts, are telling stories about rattlesnake families or social groups of rattlesnakes, or just these individual, even just taking a very, like, mundane everyday experience of a rattlesnake, but telling it in story form and individualizing the snake, and kind of focusing in on stuff that I think to most of us who look at snakes might even think is boring, because it's not rattling and flashing and killing and blah, blah, blah. It's just, Jaden, like, going about his day of hanging out and coiling in one place, and then a squirrel comes along and kicks dirt in his face. And it's nothing, like, super exciting, but that sort of, like, boring, and just the fact that that snake has a name now really seems to connect with people that aren't going to connect in a positive way to hearing about how fast that snake could kill that squirrel.
Yeah, and I'm sure you guys are in Arizona, so what species are you observing? As well as, I mean, there must be a much more interaction between rattlesnakes and humans there than, say, here in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I would expect so. There's, we started in Arizona, and we moved to New Mexico recently. Not far. It's smaller. There are a lot of rattlesnakes. New Mexico doesn't have quite the sprawl and development, and people with money moving to the outskirts of Phoenix into some big fantastic home out in the desert, and then they're like, oh my God, there are rattlesnakes here. Like, this is a problem. We have to do something about it. And it's like, dude, you moved into their habitat. So yeah, that is a problem. And the conflict is there, and there are a lot of people who didn't grow up there that don't understand the thing. And so what the issue is in a lot of cases, I mean, for them, it's a very real interaction where they have a snake on their patio, or it gets in their house or something, and they don't know what to do. But the real issue, or one of the germinal sort of issues here, is that there is the popular culture notion of what a snake is, going to the Bible and all, just stories of what snakes are for most people, is that they are out to get you. And so what Melissa's talking about with personalizing these animals, stories about what they actually do, that changes the conversation a little bit. It adds into this, people, it's almost like snakes are a separate thing. People think of them as, like, not even really animals along with other animals. It's like they are these nefarious, demonic, like the devil sent these things here, or they are an embodiment of the devil. And so, that's kind of where they're coming from, and they have a very limited understanding of what they actually are and what they do, and that they actually don't want to tangle with you. For the most part, there's not a snake out there that's going to be like, hey, human, I'm going to go get up in their business and try to do them harm. And so we do, we take our observations, and that's, it's really our love, is to be out there and watching behavior and looking at snakes out in the field. And so we try to bring those stories into a consumable form to the people so our audience isn't probably the people who are listening to this podcast. Our audience is your aunt that's like, you're crazy. I bleep myself there. But,
oh, it's okay. This is not a PG-13.
Okay, good.
Awesome.
Fucking A, let's do this.
You have free reign of everything.
So yeah, they're, we're trying to address this gap between the general public and the idea of what snakes are to most people, and bring them some real information through videos and stories, and we're trying to humanize the snake a little bit by just showing that it's just an animal like anything else. It's trying to do its thing. People love tigers. Tigers are pretty vicious predators. Like that's really shouldn't be a disqualifying factor.
Yeah, like tigers actually eat people. Like they eat people. Like it's a pretty regular part of their diet. There's probably a tiger advocate out there who's like, oh my God, stop. But like that's not like
statistically.
Yeah, I mean, there's like hardly any snakes that have the ability to do that.
Right.
And that seems, probably everyone listening to this, unless they're regularly having these conversations with their friends, are like, that's crazy that people think, but just trying to convince people that snakes have no reason to attack us or your dog, but they're like, and I'm like, but why? Why do you think they would do that? Like they have nothing to gain in this situation from going after you or your dog. Yes, even if it's a chihuahua, even if it's like a tiny toy, whatever you call the little kitten, whatever. It's like they can't eat these things. They can't eat us. They only have the opportunity to possibly get hurt and killed. Why would they want to do that? But that's not what you see. Most of us learn about animals from books. Well, not anymore. TV, movies. And yeah, I mean, even going back to like the Bible, like what I grew up with, I mean, that's where you learn about these things. And snakes, like 99.9% of the time are portrayed in all of these forms of media as, you only see them as predators. And again, like, yes, they do that. And it's really interesting and cool and important, but that they spend so little of their time doing that, which is obvious to anyone that's worked with them in the wild, or if you've kept them, it's like they don't, I mean, even as far as like animals go across the board, they don't eat that much or that often. But most people don't know that because that's all you see. Every Western, there's always a rattlesnake and it's always coming after someone. And it makes no sense if you know anything about snakes, but most people don't know anything about snakes except what they saw in that movie. And that's, it seems like maybe a silly barrier, but it is a big, important barrier to their conservation because you can't address any of these other issues if people just don't care and they want them all to be dead anyway because they're useless and scary.
Yeah, it's almost sad that we need to like grasp for all these different things, like the whole venom going towards medical research, and also the fact that no snake is going to chase you. Also the fact that they're obviously playing a role in your ecosystem.
It's hard with snakes. It's like, it's not more than just like advocate. You're having to undo so much.
Yeah, you're not starting at zero. You're starting at like negative 5.
You're having to undo years of, whether it's religion or years of watching things on TV or years of everyone in your neighborhood saying, the same, like you're having to undo and rewire so much.
And so,
or you just date a snake breeder, and that'll change your views on snakes real quick.
There's not enough of them to go around, Everyone. So you're right. And emotional responses. Snakes sort of target that emotional nerve in people, and so the rational side is not very effective at combating these emotional sort of like knee-jerk, like, those are gross, they're slimy. Like you can say like, no, it's not slimy. And they'll be like, it looks slimy, it's slimy. So that's part of our MO as well, is to use emotional appeals. So we have, like Melissa said, stories about mothers and families and these interactions. We don't really show a lot of like feeding events, although like we think they're cool when we see it in the field. It's like such a lucky thing, but we try to kind of downplay that a little bit. And we also don't rely a lot on the facts of like, the medical benefits of venom, the ecological benefits to agriculture. And so a lot of these things that are just kind of cold hard facts, we don't use those tools that much because when you're combating an emotional response, or people are just dug in and it's like, well, I don't care, I think they're gross. And once you sort of show the side of if you can get to people to at least look at these animals just sort of going about their business and doing their thing, and just seeing that, like, oh, it's actually just trying to survive and do its thing. It's like when they can relate a little bit to them, I think that breaks down a little bit of that scare factor, that entrenched fear, more than this generic sort of like, oh, they eat rats, they eat 1 million pounds of rats a year. So
what does that even mean?
I mean, those are important numbers, and those are important things to know. But for us, it's like the hatred is so powerful that, like, we try to hit them with the love.
Yeah,
definitely.
And so, what exactly does a rattlesnake den in New Mexico look like?
Show us one.
Yeah.
We'll tell you.
Yeah.
So
we're still returning to our Arizona dens to look at that. And definitely, like, we have the most information about ones that we've been going to longer in Arizona. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, we can talk about, we just recently visited for our kind of annual thing, these den sites that are shared by Arizona black rattlesnakes and Crotalus cerberus and striped whip snakes. Are they Coluber or Masticophus?
They're Masticophus.
Masticophus tenuatus. Who can keep up? Yeah, do you want to talk about what does that typically look like?
Well, so I would take it a step further back and say that, when we started, we both moved to Arizona, because it was like a mecca for reptiles. And when we first started doing field work, it was all about the monsoon season, the summertime, rainy season. Everything is going nuts. There's snakes everywhere. They're all moving around. And it's very interesting. And you can see a lot of animals that way. And it wasn't until, we met some people and they were like, oh, actually the winter, you can see a lot of stuff in the winter time when they're at their dens. And so people started bringing us to dens and with rules, with stipulations that, we don't do what we were trained to do, which is like you grab, you measure, you mark, this is science.
Yeah. Must be captured. Everybody must be captured.
So we were like, we had to go with a bag on our head and like hands tied, that's the only way they would take us there. But we were sort of like shown the light by some folks who had been doing it a long time. And that's where we really started to see that these animals, there's a lot to the interactions that they do. You can see reproductive behavior in the summertime, but that's pretty a well-defined sort of interaction and an interchange. So at the dens themselves, there's other things that go on. They come together. Some of them want to be together. Some of them don't like each other. And so there are these layers and these these plots that are playing out, and you kind of have to tune in. And really, what you can't do is get in there and muck around. And so when we started visiting, it was with binoculars, it was with cameras. We're just trying to, keep our distance. And so we'd see piles of snakes, and it was gorgeous and it was amazing, but we didn't see a lot of behavior. And so Melissa said it was some with Arizona black rattlesnakes, but also diamondbacks, Western diamondbacks will den communally as well as individually, but they do have communal dens. And so, and they're watchable in the spring and fall. They're doing some courtship behavior, and a lot of their dens is more based on access to females and reproductive activity, which is very different from the black rattlesnakes. But anyway, we started to get a grip on these aggregations of snakes and figure out like ways to study them, and what can we do here? This blows our mind every time we go, and we just want to see what it's all about. There were sort of longtime field herpers that they had pretty fantastic stories about who was who was whose mom, and who was doing what, and we wanted to kind of do a little bit more of a rigorous study and get at like what's going on here. What do these interactions mean? And we're still 10 years in, we're still feel like it's kind of in its infancy, but
and it is, but we do know more. Like we learned from others who had been trying to do this while minimizing disturbance. So how do you identify an animal without catching it and putting a microchip in it, or cutting off various pieces of their scales and tails and not tails, rattles, or painting their rattles. And, so we learned to identify them by using their patterns, which some other snake people had done. And that's also how researchers that study whales and other cetaceans, will identify them, because catching and microchipping a whale, I guess, isn't feasible. Yeah, you just, and then you just scan it. It's real easy. Yeah, I mean, it seems so obvious, but that was such a, like Jeff said, like that's what you see a snake, you grab it, you catch it, but they kind of stop behaving, or what you see once you are close enough to catch it, those are defensive behaviors, because like I explain to members of the public all the time, like they view us as a threat. So that is what you see when they see you most of the time. So that was an important part. And the other reason it was important to find a way to tell who's who without having to catch them is that we shifted from using, even binoculars and kind of sitting back to using cameras of various sorts. So we needed a way for the cameras to be able to identify, or, for us to be able to see on the stuff we were getting later with the cameras. And that, yeah, we thought before that we were seeing like natural behavior, but when you take people completely out of that situation and you just have the machine, even there you get to see things that we didn't get to see before. Like squirrels coming up and threatening rattlesnakes, mother and babies, and also adults outside of their dens. Like that would never happen while we're sitting there, even if we're pretty far away from a binocular. Like a squirrel's not going to come up and get in the middle of us and rattlesnakes. I mean, you'd have to be
a brazen squirrel, man.
They are there. Well, so we've found, and we had heard bits and pieces, and I've read in the literature that they found in squirrel guts or squirrel poop or whatever evidence of them eating snakes. But we found some baby rattlesnakes that had bite marks that looked like they were from squirrels. So they're not just threatening them, but if they get a chance, they're probably killing those baby rattlesnakes too.
Wow.
It's a good strategy. Like the adults probably can take out young squirrels. So why not take them out while you're still bigger than them? If a mother is foolish enough unlucky enough to leave them unprotected, I guess. Most of the time what we'd seen with our cameras was a squirrel approaching a nest and a mother and babies, or a babysitter and babies, and the snakes all go into shelter and nothing happens. And so we were guessing that when we found the bodies, that must have been some unattended babies, or maybe babies that had just left the nest and weren't protected anymore. Because, yeah, the squirrels in our area don't go like right up within striking distance generally of like adult rattlesnakes. Because
especially when they're all, a group of them, like you're one.
Yeah.
Do you think that they're impervious to a certain degree to their venom, or how would they avoid being bit?
They could be. So in other areas where these relationships between rock squirrels and rattlesnakes have been better studied, they found that the adult rock squirrels are at least immune enough to rattlesnake venom where it doesn't kill them. Like it'll make them sick. They're kind of like for a couple days, but they recover. But the juvenile and baby squirrels are not. And then so the adult squirrels will go after like juvenile snakes because they can take them if there's a juvenile snake like crawling around amongst their communal squirrel nest, squirrel colonies. But they won't go after the adult snakes, but they'll get close enough to let the adult snakes know that like, hey, this is not a cool place for you to be. They have these like specific tail flagging behaviors that say there's a rattlesnake here versus like there's a bull snake or there's a gopher snake or some sort of less dangerous snake. So yeah,
humans can't even tell those apart. That's amazing.
Whoa. I know, it's really interesting. And that Dr. Rulon Clark at San Diego State University, like his lab has been doing some work. So there's a lot of history of people looking at the squirrel side of things. And the snake side of things has only recently been looked at. So it's like, can the snake like actually read those signals and respond to them? And they're starting to dig into that a little bit, which is really cool. But yeah, it's sort of the way you would translate any language you can't understand. They've been looking at those squirrels, and yeah, they have the way that they wag their tails. It's very different when it's a rattlesnake versus a different kind of snake versus, what else, like, hey, I found food, or I don't know what else squirrels talk about because it's not my thing.
Did you ever?
Yeah, it's a very interesting relationship, but I think our films were the first one to show that like the squirrels were actually coming up to rattlesnake dens and their nest sites versus just doing the little squirrel dances when snakes came into their territory. But they actually seem to be sneaking or seeking the snakes out at our sites instead of the other way around. Because again, like they were just studying squirrels, so they weren't monitoring rattlesnake dens. So yeah, it is very interesting and weird.
Wow, that's something I never would have guessed to learn about squirrels.
And totally cool to get like a room full of, not snake people to show them a video of like a rattlesnake nest and the mommy and babies. And then a squirrel comes in and I tell them the story about how we found bodies once. And they're totally rooting against the cute fur for the snakes.
It's funny. Weirdly, squirrels have come up like a good amount in the last couple of podcasts. I don't know why, but I seem to be the only person who is not a fan of squirrels.
They're jerks.
Squirrels.
They're really jerks.
I know we've decided that college squirrels are different than others. College squirrels are very, very vicious and bold. And I think that's what ruined it, because during my time in college, they will come up right to you and will try to take your piece of pizza out of your hand. Like I've seen it. And so, yes.
But you don't think that that's the same animal that's going to be flagging down rattlesnakes?
I don't think that's the same. It's not the same squirrel.
No.
I mean, it's the same level of ballsiness, right? Like,
True.
We're at least as scary as a rattlesnake.
Very ballsy.
Yeah,
I would rather tangle with a rattlesnake than another human any day.
It's true. I mean, squirrels are clearly very curious, so they must. Why exactly? I mean, besides just eating, I mean, would they risk all that just to try to get a meal of a baby rattlesnake?
I feel like there's so many easier meals for them.
Yeah, I think that it's more, there is the social signaling among squirrels when they have sort of colonies of kin. What I think we're seeing mostly at the dens is they come up, squirrels are pretty quick. They're high elevation sites, so the snakes aren't always like all that warm. When they're at the dens, they're not really hunting. They're just kind of hanging out and sort of getting in the seasonal rhythm and metabolically sort of gearing back up. But they're not that warm. They're not that feisty. And I think when the squirrels come up, they're just saying like, we're onto you. We know you're here. You're not going to get us. Like, you just might as well get the hell out of here. Just move along. And I think that's kind of what it is like, for a rattlesnake to be able to get a squirrel, he's got to catch him by surprise. And when the element of surprise is gone, the rattlesnake doesn't have a good chance. So I think there is a little bit of that. And especially in the studies in California and stuff, yeah. It's like, dude, we all know you're here, man. No, you're not fooling anybody. Just
go along.
Peace. So, and I think that we see some of that at the dens, but the snakes at the dens, they're not hunting. They're just like, oh, this fucking jerk is here again. Like, just go away. It's not like a big deal. They don't really change. The big males won't really change their behaviors. They'll just be like, annoying squirrel. I'll see you in a couple months, But so it is interesting. There's this really crazy interaction there, and there's a lot to it. And at the current place where we're studying them, we actually don't see
we
squirrels.
haven't seen any rock squirrels there on the videos, or like as we've been hiking around and stuff. There's just not.
Yeah,
it's just snakes.
Yeah.
So how far out from civilization are you going for these dens?
Oh man, so the dens where we did the work for my master's thesis that was on social behavior in Arizona black rattlesnakes, where we quantified, like, they are actually choosing who they hang out with and stuff, those were like scary close to people. Like there will be times, there's a pretty well used mountain bike trail in a dirt road that was frequented by ATVs and like 4-wheel drive vehicles too, you know, where we'd occasionally have to like duck, somebody's coming kind of close. The place where we are now, it's still like there's a dirt road not that far, but it's not, it's much further from a city like ours. And there's lots of more places that are more attractive to humans in the Southwest because they're wetter and cooler. So we don't have to worry about that as much. But yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, I think that even in our part of the world, this is certainly more true where you guys are in the Northeast, that a lot of the big dens where probably all kinds of cool stuff take place are just gone because that, you know, it's a lot easier to see that. And that's a real easy way to check out a lot of snakes if you want to. And, you know, I think that a lot of, you know, again, getting back to the fear and misunderstanding of snakes, that a lot of people just see that as a great public service that they're doing to take out a den of snakes. And I know in Kentucky, where I'm from, that there was a guy I knew who had found this big timber rattlesnake den, and he told the U.S. Forest Service, because he was like, oh, you guys should know about this so you can protect it. And instead they dynamited it. And this, like, this isn't like, oh, the 20s. This was the 80s.
And not a threat to.
Yeah, and not a threat. It's just out in the national forest. You know, But they're like, well, you know, they'll get people eventually. I mean, there aren't even any cities in that part of the state. Like it was, but yeah, I mean, that's just the general snake attitude. So I think that for that reason, they tend to be not real close to cities because people have probably found them and disturbed them in one way or another. I mean, we do have another den that we've gone to, and it's kind of interesting. It's a Western Diamondback den, and it's pretty close to some highfalutin neighborhoods outside of Tucson, $1 million homes and such, and is a pretty heavily used area for mountain bikes and also for people like javelina and dove hunting. And that den, just in the relatively short time that we've known about it, 15 years, has had periods where there's 20 diamondback rattlesnakes there. And then somebody finds it and kills everyone that they see. And there are no snakes that use that site for a couple years, and then it pops back up again, and it sort of has those up and down fluctuations. But mostly the places we know about are further away. And honestly, like at this point, if I did find a den, even if it was really cool, that was that close to people and well used, like I don't want to frequent it because it just makes me anxious. You know, at the one that we went to for my master's, we've kind of stopped. And part of the reason is just every time we go there, I'm like sweating the whole walk. Like, you know, are we going to find everybody dead? Because that's happened to us before at the other den I was just talking about. So I tend to stay away from those now.
Man, that's
so we take pains to sort of, you know, protect the dens as best we can. I mean, it's sort of like, it's almost to the point where we're like, feel guilty about visiting them ourselves because it's like, oh man, like someone's going to
follow our footsteps.
You know, wonder why we're parked on the side of the road right here, you know? And so we try to be as careful as we can. I mean, we try to do it, all our work in service of the snakes. So, you know, when we put out cameras and we leave them out there, we do our best to camouflage them so you wouldn't notice them from a road. You know, the ravens wouldn't be cued into what's going, like, hey, what's going on down here? Is this a den of babies here? Or so we do our best to cover our tracks and still be able to have some information share with people to try to, you know, turn them onto our side. But we're very careful. We don't go out there as much as we could. We don't bring people that we could impress. You know, it's just like we're out there and we feel like we are exposing a little bit of the safety of these animals for kind of the greater good, and that's kind of how we justify it to ourselves. But yeah, we're terrified that somebody's going to go out there and wipe out these snakes, because we did see that happen once, and it was just, I mean, it was heartbreaking.
Yeah, it was heartbreaking. It's still, I mean, that was 15 years ago. It's still, yeah, painful.
And we talked a little bit about, obviously, the squirrels communicating, but are we seeing some forms of communication between the rattlesnakes themselves?
Well, so probably. I mean, a lot of snakes' communication is chemically through what they're smelling and sense they're giving off to each other. So those are things that we are obviously not picking up with our cameras. But a lot of the ways that we can see snakes communicating that have been identified, like I'm thinking about things like chin rubbing and courting rattlesnakes. Since we've focused on Arizona blacks and we haven't observed any courtship behavior at their dens. We don't see as much of that, but it has been kind of interesting. We don't see any obvious courtship stuff, but we have seen them a couple times, like doing that chin rubbing thing, that it almost looks like, because it's not followed by any of the other things that are usually associated with courtship, like where the male's trying to like match his tail up to the correct place with the female. They'll just, like, one snake, especially if they're like approaching a group of snakes, they'll come up to one and sort of do a quick like chin rub and then join the group or not. It almost seems like they're saying hi or introducing themselves or something. So I think we are seeing things, and we're certainly starting to see some interesting things with the whip snakes now that we're using cameras that actually have the ability to observe what whip snakes do. But we're not to the point where we can like translate that yet, because it's still, it's weird. It's like, and we've been sort of studying the social behavior for almost 10 years, but it still feels like we just started, because it's so foreign to us. I mean, humans are so sight and hearing focused. Like right now, we're watching each other through video and we're listening to each other. And not that snakes are blind and deaf, but those senses are not as important to them as smelling. And so none of this that's going on right now between the four of us and everybody else who's listening, watching, like, is basically important at all to a snake.
It's subtle by design, right? They're trying to keep their cover from predators and prey. So they they're trying to keep it on the down low as best they can. So the chin rubbing that the rattlesnakes do during courtship, I think that's more of a generalized interaction than what people that keep and breed might think. It is sort of this, like, if you're at a crowded party and you're trying to squeeze behind someone and you put your hand on their shoulder, like, oh, coming through. You don't want to just sort of barge through and have them be like, what the hell are you doing? It's sort of this polite, like, I'm just a snake, I'm crawling over your back. It's no big deal. But there are other things that go on in sort of a tactile behavioral sort of way where, some snakes will coil on top of other snakes. Some snakes will rest their head on top of another snake. And we don't know really if is that a positioning? Is that a social hierarchy that's being worked out? Is that just a friendly thing? Is it, just like, hey, like, we're buds? We don't really know. And actually we've talked about trying to get some of these behaviors that we see into sort of an easy to digest and easy to kind of flip through format, and have people that have a lot of experience with snakes, that just kind of know snakes, and even people that don't know snakes, like, to look at these behaviors and say, like, what do you think is going on here? Is this anything? And so if you get a lot of people that are like, yeah, that looks like that guy's being a dick, then okay, so maybe that seems like a agonistic interaction. But there's so much subtlety to snake behavior that it's tough. But it is really a fascinating thing, and we've gone from using time-lapse footage. We've tried to work more as the technology improves and battery life improves. We've tried to go with more like sort of real time, GoPro 30 frame a second kind of thing, rather than one frame every 30 seconds.
Or 60 seconds.
Yeah. So that's a lot of our work initially was time lapse. where you see snakes moving around. These snakes are moving slow as molasses usually, but in terms of like, reactions to things that are going on, you don't really catch a lot of that. So now that we're getting more actual sort of footage that is in real time, I think we can read a little bit more into what's going on and be able to share that stuff. And that's kind of what we're working on now is getting some of this stuff. And there was, for example, one time last year, I think we threw up a video, some clips of how rattlesnakes were dealing with these whip snakes at their den. And these are not things that we were able to observe, but by leaving cameras there, we saw that these whip snakes are kind of spazzy and they're all over the place and they're cruising around. And there is some evidence that they may eat young rattlesnakes. Other types of whip snakes will. But what we're seeing is these whip snakes are, they don't really seem to notice the rattlesnakes too much. But when the rattlesnakes are like, they have to cross over this whip snake that's sitting there, they kind of like, they sort of just like brace themselves against them. And they're like, you're not going to get my neck, like I'm going to go by you, but I'm just going to sort of like make sure I have a good little coil here. I'm just going to try to push you out of the way as I go by. And so just really interesting stuff like that. And so you can read into these interactions a little bit. The rattlesnakes don't do that to each other. They might give a little gentle, like, hey, I'm coming through. But they're not just like, I don't trust you, and you're just kind of a spazzy, like douchey kind of a snake. I'm gonna do my best to kind of protect myself. And so we're trying to find, see more examples of this kind of thing that are a little bit easier to read into their behavior and their interactions a little bit.
Is there anything like more in depth than just them seeking shelter? Is there any reason why they would, den together or be found in a similar place?
I imagine that the multiple species in the same place, that is more to do with its, environment, climate-wise, like that's just a good place for all of them to be. Because even when you get something like, sometimes you'll find in a den Western diamondback rattlesnakes and some of the mammals that during the summer, they're definitely like eating all summer long. But they don't during the winter, and the little mammals probably know that, because they've all been using that den together for centuries, and that seems like that could have been the case with the whip snakes and the rattlesnakes too in the winter, and so they'll tolerate each other because this is a good whatever their list of things they're looking for in a den. This fulfills all those requirements, and so that's probably just environmental, but for the within a species, why they are using this spot instead of this other spot. The sites where we worked for my master's research, there were two groups of dens, it was probably two different dens and then some basking sites associated with each one. They were only about 400 yards away from each other. And during the summer, that's a distance easily traveled by a medium to large size rattlesnake. I mean, that's nothing. They could do that in a day. But during the course far as we know, we've got some friends that are still going to those sites, and we've known about them and have, visited them off and on for 10 years. And there is no mixing of those snakes. The ones that, are one winter at site A, they are never seen at site B. If you're born at site B, you don't overwinter, you don't nest at site A, because these sites are also used for nesting. So they are distinct communities. This is how people that study social behavior and other species of animals determine that they interact with each other, but there's no mixing across. So that speaks to something more than just environmental. There's some reason that they're returning to those things. And that was sort of what we were investigating when we started there. Like, is this just, climate? Is this just a random pile of snakes that this is the only place they can go? Is there something more? So within those sites, we looked at, on a given day, at the bigger of the two sites, there were about 90 individual animals that we identified. And you'd think, and these are pretty small areas, it's one den, that you'd see them all together at one point, but most of them, that's not the case. They had, like, within those groups, They would have some animals that they were with like half the time. Half the time you would see Spooky, she was with Allie. Like they were almost always together, but you never saw Spooky with, 20 other snakes that lived at that site. So they were making choices about who they would, besides just the site in general and what site they would pick, but who they would hang out with on the surface when they were there. And underground, who knows what's happening because we didn't have cameras on that. But when they were hanging out together on the surface, like they were making choices of who they would hang out with and who they didn't. And then, not our work, but people that have worked with like timber rattlesnakes have found that females and juveniles are more likely to den and hang out with at the den site relatives than non-relatives. That wasn't true of males, but it was true for adult females and juveniles of both sexes.
That's so surprising to me.
But you think during breeding season, your males will start to drift and that's how you get genetic diversity? I mean, are they mixing in some fashion?
I would assume so, because those in that system, they're traveling greater distances from their dens. And, generally the way rattlesnakes work, because most of them don't give birth every year, the females have, years when they're pregnant and tending babies. And then the next year or 2 or 3 or when they're like out and feeding, and that's when they're breeding with males. So yeah, that's probably how they're crossing. And and I imagine that the males, like the den and birthplace they start off at, they're going to other sites to find females. And that was something we were hoping to look at more closely with our sites, but we weren't able to get enough DNA samples. This is kind of the tricky thing of, we don't want to handle them and disrupt their behavior, but you actually do need to handle them well. Handling them is the easiest way to get DNA samples. You can get shed skin, but you're not like guaranteed to get it from every snake the way you were if you were catching them. So because there had been some work done on the relatedness for rattlesnakes with ours, we wanted to focus on those individual behaviors and interactions first. And we're hoping to follow up with looking at how relatedness affected those relationships. But just, we haven't sent the DNA off for analysis, but I don't think we got enough to do it, unfortunately. But that's what it seems like was probably the case, that they are matrilineal groups that are led by females, and the males are the ones who are dispersing, but we don't have hard data on that.
And Jeff, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Oh, just sort of getting back to your question a little bit about why they would den together. When we embarked on the social nature, studying sort of, are these things social? The prevailing hypothesis is that in northern climate, in cold areas, denning habitat is very limited. Places where snakes are going to not freeze is limited. So they all come together. They just happen to be in the same place because there's not that many places to go, because it is so cold. And that may very well be true, that there are places there. It is true that there are places that are better than others. Obviously, you don't see them going under a frisbee-sized rock and spending the winter. They're going to not make it. So, but what I do think is, as we've sort of like seen a little bit further into the social side of things, is that the social side is sort of the mechanism by which they can find these spots, and these spots develop into these dens because there is sort of a survival of the fittest in a cultural sense, so that they the places where the snakes survive year after year, there are more and more snakes that it smells like more and more snakes. It doesn't smell like dead snakes, so more and more snakes. They develop a affinity over time for going to where other snakes are. And so we see that in timber rattlesnakes, they have sort of, they'll follow each other around. Rulon Clark has shown that snakes, and I think this was in a contrived sort of an experimental framework, where a snake has successfully gotten a prey item, other snakes will go to that same exact spot and set up to hunt, like, hey, Judy did awesome here. I'm going to try this spot. And so this use of public information, that these snakes can smell what's gone on, they can read a little bit into the history, that is very beneficial at northern latitudes. And we see it in timber rattlesnakes. I think we see a very similar thing in Arizona black rattlesnakes they are the basal group. They are the first split off of prairie rattlesnakes, who also will den in great numbers, as pretty famous. But the Arizona black rattlesnake is the offshoot from prairies that sort of begat the Oreganus clade, all the western, the northern Pacific rattlesnakes that really have been successful in northern and mountainous places where it gets very cold in the winter. And I think a lot of that ability to exploit those habitats that are extremely seasonal has to do with this social facility for finding where other snakes are hanging out, and they can read into the successes a little bit. So like you see somebody that's winning at the slot machine, like when they're gone an hour later, like you might go try that slot machine, and if it's a hot one, then like you're gonna win too. So it's a very interesting kind of evolutionary trajectory that they've kind of figured out, like like we're gonna pay attention to what's going on, and so is it learning? Are they learning these things, or is it more of a hardwired, like we're just gonna follow this scent until it seems good? And so there's tons of questions, and a lot of this is just like me having a couple beers and looking at the sky and being like, oh,
just thinking.
Cool. Like, so we don't, we haven't published on this, but I think there really is a story here that these dens for these northern snakes, there really is this aspect that they're into what each other is doing, and that has led to their success. They come out and they breed, they bask together. They have these basking sites that they'll use year after year, and the juveniles will try. They'll follow different ones around. They actually aren't that particular about who they hang out with, but they do like to hang out with other snakes, and they're kind of like, oh yeah, this is a good spot, like in the next year you find them shedding in the same place where one shed the year before. And so they're kind of keying in, and they're learning from each other, and whoever is alive is successful. And in a sense of they survived past being a baby, and so there is some there's something there, and they're following each other around, and they're doing cool stuff, and it blows my mind. I'm just get a little verklempt.
Yeah, I think like snakes are the last thing that for a while we would equate with communicating or intelligence or any type of learned behavior. It was always just like an extremely dumb creature that runs off of just basic instincts, and that's pretty much it.
Yep.
So knowing that kind of stuff is like mind blowing in comparison to to the last however long.
And you get that sense sometimes from captive born stuff. They don't have to deal with any of this stuff. They get a dead piece of meat again, like sweet, like it's like the kid that never went to school. They don't really have to be that sharp. It doesn't matter. So when you get to see this stuff in the wild, these dens that I don't know, how long has this den been active? Is this been a continuous thing that snakes have figured out where to hang out for 1,000 years, 10,000 years? We don't know how much it is an accumulation of like snake scents that have SCENT that are on these rocks that they're all queuing into and remembering, or not remembering, but keying into. We have no idea how much of that is there, and it's just it's what would it be like if it wasn't like that? There are other species in contrast. Things like Mojaves and some of the like sidewinders and things that aren't as geographically faithful. They kind of have a wide open landscape. They don't have these fixtures in their environment that they got to return to every year. So it's a way different story. Like they're sort of more on their own, and there's a benefit, an evolutionary benefit to just being more of a wanderer and maybe figuring out for yourself. And just reading the tea leaves, and I'm going to hunt here because it smells like a rat. So there, you see these different behaviors, and it's a nice contrast to these kind of colder climate, high elevation animals that do come together. It's fascinating.
In the chat, Carly was asking about the two dens you were talking about that are about 400 yards apart. She said, I wonder if something happened to Den A where they can't use it anymore. Do you think the majority would go to Den B? Or, like, would there be the overcrowding? Like, since right now they're not mixing at all, but like total hypothetical question. But yeah.
Yeah, no, that is an interesting question. And we have thought about that because there at a different site, there was a den. It used to be a den, and then we haven't seen rattlesnakes there for a long time. And it actually is one that's sitting that we called the road den because it's right next to the road. And, we've seen people picnicking up there and stuff. And then we haven't seen a rattlesnake there for a long time. And we're just like, well, maybe they just got sick of dealing with those people versus like some sort of violence happening or maybe some combination. It's like, yeah, so what? And fortunately, it wasn't a site where we had been working often enough to identify individuals and see them pop up in other places. But yeah, we were kind of speculating about that too. Like, so do they just die? Do they not go anywhere? Do they go to that other den, which is, I don't know, the next closest one's probably even less than 400 yards. And yeah, I mean, I think they would. So that in places where people have studied it, they have shown that at least with baby rattlesnakes, the mechanism that they find their winter den the first time is by following the scent of their mom or even other rattlesnakes of the same species. So it seems like they could do that. But then again, with this, is there some sort of hierarchy or other thing? Would the other snakes welcome them in? Is there some maximum amount that those dens could hold? And they're like, no, you're not related to me. We've already got our 50 snakes. You got to move on. Yeah, I don't know. And that's, something that someone who's more interested in that question than maybe the snakes themselves. There's kind of horrible experiment there waiting to happen.
Interesting question. An experiment that we're not prepared to do.
No,
but it's cool, and who knows? But another observation that I'll bring up is that at one of our sites, it's pretty high elevation. It gets cold, and the timing is similar to northern timbers, where they're giving birth in early September, and then by early October they're getting ready to bed down for the winter. And we've done a lot of work in the birthing season, so that's early to mid-September. We've been up there a lot. And what we see is snakes will kind of come back and check on things. They'll kind of check it out. They'll come through, and they'll actually, a male will come through and see what's going on in a nest, check out the babies, and the babies will be like, oh, big guy, hang out. But it's almost like they're just okay, just the den's still here. See who's hanging out. That seems all good. So there is it's not like they're shooting back to the den and they're just going down, and maybe some do that. Maybe some are out there a little bit late, but there is a little bit of scoping it out. If there is a decision to be made, they I think they allot themselves that opportunity. If they came to a den and it was, so we had another den where they did some prescribed burning, and they did a lot of, it was we didn't study it very long. We only ever found a few snakes there, but they had come through, the Forest Service had come through and cut down some trees and burned some slash piles. So this rock pile that, had a nice big oak growing out of it, and had, it was a little bit tempered from some of the brutal high elevation sun. It just kind of became real scorching. So after, we found it, and I think there was a couple snakes there. The next year we found a couple snakes, but then that was kind of it. So the conditions can change at these places. There can be a fire, there can be some manipulations like what the Forest Service did to this particular spot, and it can change. And I think they do have the ability to probably follow other scent trails and be like, oh, we got to find someplace else, or even, there's probably the individual that's maybe gonna, I'm gonna start my own den over here. I hate all these other guys. I like this area to hunt in the summer, so I'm gonna be way over here. And maybe they'll probably give it a go. Occasionally we find an individual snake by itself in the spring. So So there probably is a little bit of crossing and exploring, but it's probably at a level that we just don't detect.
Yeah, because we're obviously like biased by the most successful. Like we know where this den is, so we're always going to look there. So even though we try to like scout around and look at anything else that to our eyes seems like could be a place, you know, we're definitely missing some, especially if there's only one snake there, because it's not like they're out every day, so they're real easy to miss. And it's just, you know, it's easier to find a rock pile that's big and has 20 snakes than the one where there's like 2 guys. But yeah, I mean, that almost certainly happens, and we've definitely seen like within these sites how they use them change with vegetation changes. So this was a good basking site last year associated with this rock pile, but now, you know, it got burnt, or we had a lot of rain over the winter, so it's not getting good sun. So now they've shifted over to the other side, and we've seen, you know, what we think are other snakes queuing in on that. There was one snake, Alice, who gave birth to Butterfly at, you know, this nest site, and then 5 years later or 6 years later, when Butterfly was old enough to give birth, her mom, Alice, had since moved her nest to a nearby rock pile, which could have been due to vegetation changes or boredom, I don't know. But instead of Butterfly returning to where she was born, she went to her mom's nest site that year, even though it was a new site. Yeah, the current site. So probably like, you know, cueing off of what the snakes were doing instead of just, you know, sort of the robotic, you know, we think about some animals, it's like, this is where I was born, like turtles. And I'm not calling turtles dumb or robots, but you know, this is probably an assumption about them too. You know, they just returned to the beach where they were born. That's what we would have predicted. And as much as anything for Butterfly was she was going to go back to the nest where she was born, but instead she went to her mother's new nest, which she, you know, had to have found like based off, you know, smelling her mother was there, and maybe detecting that other site for whatever reason wasn't good 6 years later. But it was interesting to see her follow that. So there is some plasticity associated with these behaviors, and a lot of which we're missing because we're limited by what we can see and find, and how
the amount of cameras you can put out.
Yeah, how many cameras we can put out for sure. Yeah, I mean, so many things. I mean, a lot of this stuff, like, you know, it's like, oh, it's new, it's cool, we didn't know about this before. A lot of these behaviors, we did kind of know about them before, but because people and honestly, like snake scientists being kind of the worst, like we make these assumptions that snakes aren't capable of these things. So we don't look past, you know, explanations about, you know, it was like hundreds of years when white people were like, oh, well, the mom is there with the baby snakes because she's too tired to crawl away. And so they didn't bother looking for anything else because that's the assumption. Snakes are not capable of these things. So that's the end of story. And if you don't look for it, you're not going to see these other things until someone's with more open mind. And this is not us. I mean, I heard about this from someone else before we started looking at it, you know, considered that maybe there were other things going on. So yeah, we're just, you know.
And just as an aside, the things that we've seen are the squirrel story where, you know, mom snake gives birth and the squirrel is hassling. You know, the squirrel comes in and checks for a few days, but then once and there's not much effect from the mother snake. But then once the babies are born, you know, the squirrel shows up, the snake rears up and is like, get the hell out of here. So you get that to the squirrel, and we experience that where we'd be checking on these pregnant females who are out basking. They're cooking babies. You know, they're out. They're in the sun every day. They're just trying to like get these things to develop so they can move on with their life. And they would be very tolerant of us. We'd get up there and get these like cool photos. Like, hey, this is a good. You know, like
yeah, she likes me. We're friends.
They wouldn't rattle and bail. You know, but then once the babies are born, you know, we had, I think, the very first nest. The very first year that we studied this stuff, Woody is like under this rock and she's got babies under there and she's coming out of this hole at us like, oh, you don't even get over here.
Yeah,
you know?
She chased me. She chased me away from her nest.
Don't tell people that.
I had a snake chase.
Yeah.
So they're, you know, it's pretty clear there's a change in behavior. They're protecting their babies. You know, very early on in the first days, what we've seen on a couple cameras is the female will poke her head out, like they'll be inside. It's early, it's cold. The female will kind of like, coast is clear, okay, and then all the babies come out. You know, there's this reading of the environment, and the babies are respecting, you know, the mom somehow. However, that's, you know, enforced and governed is still, you know, very much open to study. But we've just seen these very tantalizing little tidbits of, you know, the mom is cued in, and she's watching out for these guys.
Yeah.
And over the course of the first couple of weeks, the babies get more and more bold, and pretty soon mom's like, you're on your own now. But it's, you know, it's pretty clear, you know, behavior is a difficult thing to get good sample size on. You know, it's such, to be very quantitative about it is difficult. To get the numbers where you're like, this proves that, you know, this is unrefutable evidence that this is going on. So we kind of have to rely a little more, because we're averse to manipulating these snakes too much. We have to rely a little bit more on these like anecdotes that we've seen over and over. And, you know, anecdotes that you see over and over actually are
Those
data.
are data.
Right.
So 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, it's consistent among different snakes, then it's pretty compelling evidence. And
there's only so much you can do with the timing and, you know, just the way snakes,
Mm-hmm.
you know, live in general.
It's hard to, you know, slap this stuff in a hard-hitting journal when you've got, like, you saw it 4 times, you know, but it's a convincing story, and we're, you know.
Yeah, and we're more interested in, you know, and we do intend to publish some of the social behavior stuff, but I think what we think is more important for the snakes and conservation is getting these messages out to the public. And a compelling story about 1 or 2 snakes is more meaningful to people than statistics anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, not totally a lazy thing, but the storytelling, I mean, that's real important. That's how humans communicate with each other. I mean, myths, fables, Game of Thrones, whatever, you know. That's how we learn. That's how we speak to each other. So yeah, so it's important to get those out there too.
Yeah, it's how you relate to other beings. You know, your N of 100 and your P of 0.001. Like that doesn't really do it for most people.
Yeah, and you know, and thinking about how, you know, for all of us that care about snakes, and it's maybe not, you know, in your hands or your ability or, you know, your interest to like go to school and get degrees and get a job at, you know, whatever you think it means to do conservation, to do like, you know, get a job at a wildlife agency or an NGO or whatever. Telling stories and sharing your knowledge, and for working with animals like snakes, but I mean, this is true of a lot of wildlife, really. You know, using stories to share, you know, not just positive messaging about snakes, but even stories to illustrate like a conservation problem. If you can do it, that is a way that anyone can get involved in conservation and help wildlife, or help, you know, even like issues that seem like they don't lend themselves very well to storytelling, you know, something like climate change. Well, that's boring. That's just about temperatures going up and down. But if you can tell a story about a den site that, you know, has been like on the decline because it's been drying out and it's been getting hotter, and now it's no longer a place for these snakes to go. But, you know, there's a lot of ways that you can use stories and just your individual observations of what you've learned about these animals from seeing them in the wild that can have a huge impact. Because, I mean, yeah, stories are powerful. They can be powerful in both directions. So anytime we can use them in a positive way to help the animals and the places we care about, like, do it.
Yeah, I think scientists aren't very often good orators, or, you know, they do all this research, but you can't, you know,
There's
translate it to the general
not emotion
public.
in science most of the time.
Which makes sense.
I get it. Right. I don't, you know, but in this case, you want the emotion.
It's become very dogmatic that you can't, you know, thou shalt not think about snakes as humans. Like anthropomorphism is totally forbidden. But like Melissa said, it's how we relate to things. It's how our brains think is through experience and having empathy for something is, that's how you experience, that's how we go through life is that's how we understand other things that are going on, is through the experience of things. So like we kind of can relate. If we can relate to it, then we can understand it better. And so stories are great for that. But the other thing, as we're hitting you with our messaging here, is like, you've already got converts here. But one of the things that we try to do, and this is another thing where we're like, turned our back on the science commandments, is that, we use pronouns for we don't call everything it, because we don't know. It's like, it looks like it's probably a male. Go ahead and call it a he. You can call it a he. You can ascribe a little bit of like motivation when you're just talking about a snake.
Use a name.
Yeah, names are good, but just talking about them like they have motivations, and if you're in a conversation with the general public, if you're at a show or you're talking to family members, it's like kind of getting into their perspective a little bit, even if it's even if you're just bullshitting, that has an effect on people to where they they don't consider it as so much of an other, as so much of a cold like killing machine. So just in everyday language, trying to say, like he or she, or the mom, this is the mom, this is the baby, moms and babies, these are like kind of tug at the heartstrings. So there is a lot of like language stuff that you can shift. The way that people say, talk about snakes as being aggressive or that they attack. It's, we tend to favor things like defensive-ness, and these are just defensive behaviors. So there's a lot of things that are subtle that you can do that can kind of change the conversation a little bit,
and that are no less correct than, no one thinks twice about talking about an animal or a snake being aggressive or scared. Those are emotions. That is implying an intent that we don't know most of the time. You can kind of measure fear, but aggression, that's sort of like having to get into their head and knowing like, their thoughts. But somehow when you talk about it's like, oh, this snake likes another one, or they love this one, it's like, oh, that's anthropomorphic. It's not any more than talking about them being aggressive or scared. Like, they're all emotions. So you can kind of pick and choose to, use these and not use these. And they are, just as backed by science. When I talk about some of the findings from the social behavior work, when we talk about two snakes that spent more than, a statistically significant amount of time together, they're called friends. Because when I look at people I know and think about who spends a statistically significant amount of time together compared to others, they're friends. That's just a word that, most people understand versus
fewer syllables than spending a statistically significant time.
Yeah. And whatever I had to call it in the thesis. I don't even remember, because it was like nonsense words, because we can't use friends.
It's too loaded.
Yeah, it's too loaded. But it's like, it has a definition that is backed by math and observations, like, so why not use that? And people understand it. And a mommy is just a mommy. Like, yeah, I could say mother or the parent of, or I don't know what, but it's the mommy. Is the babysitter. Like, that's what they're doing.
Yeah, I think it's something that even in the hobby we shy away from, obviously.
But see, it's hard in the hobby.
It gets more negative.
The pendulum swings so far that way a lot in the hobby.
Because then you're treating a snake like a mammal, and you're doing more bad than good. And
then I'm like,
tickling it.
Right. When there's two snakes out in the wild who choose to spend time together, yes, I'll call those friends. Your snake that you have in your house isn't choosing.
That you're co-having,
right.
Yeah.
You're not choosing to spend time. They don't have a choice in that matter. Like,
you're forcing their companionship. You're forcing that.
There. So it's like that. I don't say, like, when people are like, oh, my snake really loves me.
They share a gel.
I'm like, I can't say that your snake really loves you.
Yeah.
Like, I can't go that way. Like, I'm not on board with that.
Yeah.
You may be an interesting warm obstacle. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that is different. And when we talked more, when we lived in a place for a while where there were individual snakes that lived around our house, so we knew them by name, and we'd be like, oh, so like, is Henry the Western Diamondback, like, he's your friend? And I was like, well, I think of him that way. I doubt if he thinks of me at all, like, I don't think he thinks of me that way at all. I wish, but I don't think so. And I don't trust that he's thinking of me that way, because much as I like him, I'm not petting him because he's still a rattlesnake. If he got scared, like, that would be an expensive and painful hospital bill
for your friend.
For my friend and me. Yeah.
So I guess, and something that we didn't really hit on, but kind of predation. What are you seeing that is feeding on the rattlesnakes, and also what are they feeding on?
Good question. So we haven't, I thought, and that was kind of like the dream when we started putting cameras on the nest, especially, was to see a predation event, because I really wanted to see a rattlesnake mommy defend, her babies. And we did see her. We have seen one or a couple times them defend from a squirrel threat, but not a predation, not a predation event on either side that we've caught, and we haven't.
This guy showed up at one of our dens last week.
Hey.
He was about.
Did he have a meal?
Well, we didn't see it on camera, but he was whatever it is, she was maybe 10 feet away from at least 14 rattlesnakes. And it may be the time of year when they're not looking for a huge meal like that. But
so, in case anyone is just listening and not watching, that was a picture of a desert king snake. And they're very well known, like, snakes and rattlesnakes specifically are well represented in the diet of that species of king snake. So to have one show up at your den, that was the closest I've come to, like, we have to pull that snake out of this crack and get him out of here, because like, there were lots of babies there, and we didn't, like, we couldn't have if we wanted to. Yeah, we couldn't if we wanted to. And I didn't, he's still a snake and I like him, but I just would like him better if he was somewhere else. But yeah, we've never gotten footage of somebody preying on a snake. We have observed a couple times. We were road cruising one night. We saw a great horned owl that landed near a tiger rattlesnake. And then someone might have gotten out of the car and scared the owl away. And then you came across a king, or you've come across a king snake.
I've seen
another snake.
Yeah, I've seen king snakes eating snakes. We've had a number of snakes with radio transmitters in them succumb to predators. Most of the time, it's not obvious. You find a transmitter with a little dried up skin or whatever on it, and that's all you get. But one time, we had a black-tailed rattlesnake that was in a hole for way too long, and I went out there. It was maybe 2 weeks later, and there's this 4-foot king snake shed that's coming out of this hole, and it's like, oh man, poor girl. So and then after a little bit more time, we dug up, and that was just the transmitter. So it seemed like the king snake ate this rattlesnake, digested, shed, and crapped out the transmitter and got out of there.
A lyre snake, there was a transmitter and a lyre snake that ended up in a great horned owl nest. So that was almost definitely predated on.
Yeah, there are probably a half a dozen transmitters we've found where it's kind of like, was it a fox, a coyote? It's tough to say if you go 2 or 3 days between tracking.
And I know we found, like, a few times we've seen, we've like put a camera on a snake hunting and seen something that looked like a strike attempt. A couple times, and we found dead or dying animals that, like, they didn't have. It's like, okay, a pack rat or a kangaroo rat doesn't just stumble out of the bushes and collapse. Like, that seems like you might have gotten bit by something, kind of thing. And so then we've like watched it and seen a snake find it. That's happened a couple times. But did we ever, the tree lizard, the Arizona black rattlesnake eating a tree lizard? That was. Did you find him with the lizard, or?
No, that's the only.
Okay, that is the only one.
Yeah, this is
not a video that we've shared because it's terrible to watch.
This is a previously unreleased
Yeah.
So yeah, I was on a hike and I saw a snake that was hunting near a little water hole, and I was like ready for lunch. I put a video camera on it, and then I went around the rock, and I was like eating.
Something.
I was eating my sandwich, and I heard this commotion, and I'm like, "What the heck?" And I look over, and the snake's like sitting there with a lizard in its mouth, and the camera got it, but I didn't see it personally. But that's the only like strike that I've been. That's as close as I've got to witnessing a strike in the wild.
I'm so shocked.
It's
happened so fast, and it's such a, I mean, and you have to have like so much patience and good luck to be like there when it happens.
And when you're there, you're suppressing their behavior. So this is something that we see on our time lapse and our videos is, these are running for days and days and days. And we actually, when we're trying to get the full activity, and we try to stay away from these areas, but sometimes it's like you got to change out data cards or batteries. And so sometimes, or you got to go to town because you got some bullshit human activity you got to do. So it's, and I guess I got to go at 3 o'clock. So you go up there and you change out the batteries. And so what you see on some of these cameras is, you might see a shadow of a human. So these snakes are all moving around, they're doing things, they're interacting. And then there's 10 minutes where they're just like, oh shit. And that's just happens to coincide when you're there. So when you're there, they don't look like they're doing anything. They don't look bothered, but you're suppressing their behavior.
Yeah. And their prey and their predators are threatened by us as well. Like we're kind of not top of the food chain, but pretty much everybody's scared of us. So they're not going to show up when you're there either. We never get to see the squirrels coming up to the snakes. Like that doesn't happen when you're sitting there. If you're sitting there with a snake, like owl isn't going to come and like try to take one out, like because they don't like us either. And the lizards actually maybe would come up, but yeah, same thing with like the little mammals and stuff, because it's that human elephant. We ruin everything.
So how far, are you away exactly from the den when you're doing this?
So when we've been like intense studying at a site, like often we'll have a campsite that's like a 20-minute drive or walk, depending on the terrain, so that we can kind of like our system. And we were doing the social behavior work, which was the most like we would go out like early in the morning before the snakes would come out. We'd change any batteries and flashcards in the cameras that needed to be changed, and then would just leave it for 24 hours. Or we might come in the middle of the day to just kind of go around just in case we had camera failure. And we walk around with our DSLRs and binoculars and try to document everybody that was out. So we'd have better photos and then also just backups. That's the ideal situation. That isn't always the case. Lately, since we're not graduate students who have nothing to do except that, we'll go out, for a weekend and stay somewhere close by and set up cameras in the morning and come get them the next day. Or now that we've been kind of messing around with GoPros to get better video, the batteries and memory doesn't last as long because, man, those little suckers like generate like hundreds of gigs in, I don't know, over the course of a few hours. So you're just constantly changing stuff and having to visit, every like 2 or 3 hours, which is not ideal because you're probably messing up their behavior. Although then we watch it and it's like, oh, but they return to normal pretty quickly or what looks like normal.
It's a sort of a composite methodology. And yeah, we don't have our driving force here is that we want to get footage of these animals doing what they normally do. And so, but there's like a little bit of give and take because, we also want to identify individuals. So the best way to do that often is to use your zoom lens and get just that right angle. So yeah, ideally the cameras would do all the work, but sometimes we go in and, we have to be there for the equipment for whatever reason. But then we also we want to get a quick count of how many snakes are here. So we'll go around and we tried, spooking them. It's sort of the, when you play Operation and you hit the side, it's like you hear a buzz and you're like, oh man, I'm out. My turn's over. So we try to not disturb their behavior, but it's unavoidable at some level. But so ideally, yeah, we're we're letting the cameras do all the work, but we do refine over time. So we, we're there during the day to try to figure out like where are these guys going, and then we watch footage, and then it's like, well, we need to change this camera angle because of the sun or because the snakes are mostly here, or so it's kind of like an iterative process where we're trying to refine it and get the cleanest information we can. But typically, spooking a snake is like you're doing it wrong. If they're just holding tight, we hope that they habituate just a little bit to us, where we're not going to, totally disrupt the party. But it'll just be like, dude, my parents, like, all right, they're gone. We can go back to what we were doing. So that's kind of our, that's kind of what we do. We never handle snakes at dens. We don't want to change their behavior at all. We do have some evidence of a den where they were doing some mark recapture, and people said that before this study began, the snakes were out on the surface. They would still rattle and spook, but you'd see stuff going on. And then once they started grabbing and measuring and marking every snake, they were just, you'd hear a buzz and the tail going down, into the rocks. They changed their behavior, and it makes sense. If they're persecuted, they're going to do something different.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing that's between these dens where the social behavior stuff was focused, and the place where we work now is we actually see quite a difference in the behavior of the snakes. Where what was nice about this first place is that the snakes really didn't spook too much. They would sit out and they would just kind of like, you could get in there and you could get some pretty photos. You could be 5 feet away, and for the most part, you wouldn't notice a change in their behavior. But where we work now, it's like if they see you, they're just like, no, we don't like you at all. We're gonna bail. We're gonna buzz. We're gonna like get into cover as quick as we can. So it's much more of a tenuous kind of a endeavor. We're really trying to dance around the outskirts as much as we can and use binoculars and long lenses.
So you mentioned identifying them. How does one identify visually that many snakes, whether it's, sex, and then also, just distinguishing between?
Yeah. So the sex is a little easier. So after you've looked at so many rattlesnakes, especially in a single place, adult male rattlesnakes, most species tend to have relatively larger heads and longer tails, and then generally are just usually bigger than females. So when we're classifying them as males, the way that we classify them, we're males, females, and we mean adult males, adult females, and juveniles, which were basically defined as they are not big enough to be able to tell the difference yet. Once they reach sexual maturity, female rattlesnakes, based on available research and data, shift all of their resources into having babies. So they basically stop growing, or their growth slows a whole lot, whereas the males just keep getting bigger because they aren't spending as many resources on having babies. They have to use some for like finding females, but it's not as costly as it is for the females. So that's a little more straightforward. So what we did to identify individuals, because we wanted to actually be able to say not just males and females do different stuff, but we want to be able to say Spooky is behaving differently than Mole Man and Alice. So
I like these names.
Yeah, how do you even come up with all the names?
You have to use names, otherwise, like you'll never.
So confusing.
Yeah.
We worked on a project, and there were these two female snakes. They were number 272 and 273. Also, they hung out together a lot, and people messed up those data all the time. They would label, because the numbers were real similar and they did similar things. There was no way to look at the data and tell which one it was because they used the same spots. So we started calling those snakes Nicole and Susan, and that stopped. People didn't get them confused anymore. So that was part of it. And yeah, our names, it's sort of mixed. Sometimes we decide on a theme. Like I had Jedi snakes at one point. We had our first group of mommies at the site for the master's thesis. We were naming them after our grandmothers. That's
it's
Alice,
an honor.
Lois. Yeah, it was an honor. I mean, I don't know how my grandmother would have felt about it. And then sometimes it's just so Spooky was because she was actually of the group of grandmothers. That was not the name of anybody's grandmother, but she was the snake. You'd know if you'd gotten too close to that group because she would spook first and would hide. And the other three that she hung out with a lot tended to kind of stick around, but Spooky would always go. So sometimes it's behavior related. Sometimes it's because they have, so Mole Man was an Arizona black rattlesnake that I thought, the first time I saw him, I thought he was a blacktail, and their scientific specific name is Molossus. So he was Mole Man.
So, and a lot of these things like spook, the behavioral, that comes after you've already kind of got to know them. So initially, they do look the same. And so it's only becomes, so what we look for is identifying features.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about.
Yeah, so you see, you know, like their living segment on their rattle, some of them will have like a little, it'll be black, but there will be a peach colored splotch on one side. And that even after they shed, like there's still kind of this nice light color. So that's how Peach got her name. And then you look for the blotches. A lot of them, they have, especially the juveniles that have blotches with irregularities, anomalies. There'll be blotches that are joined together, or they'll have a little, like, you know, we say like a Florida hanging off of it. And sometimes they just have blotches that looked like, reminded us of things, and that would become their name. So there was Africa, and you mentioned butterfly, and there was cock and balls, and like all these different things where there's like, oh yeah, you see it and you're like, oh yeah, of course, you know, like there's the one with the 2 S's. So it was like,
yeah. So there's the how they get their names. And then, yeah, we had a system that we learned from someone else who was studying snakes by not, you know, not using microchips or scale clips or any of the usual ways. And he would draw them. And so on the Arizona blacks, they have blotches down their backs, kind of like picture, I mean, timber rattlesnakes have this too, and diamondbacks. And yeah, if you don't think about it, they all look the same. They just have a bunch of circles on their backs or diamonds. But yeah, if you really look at them, none of those blotches, and some of them are wildly different. And so we would count and say like, okay, number 3 starting at their head is connected to number 4 on the right, on the left, or number 5 is a heart shape. And so we would find at least 3 weird blotches, and that's how we would identify them. And because some of these animals we did handle when they left the social sites, and we would paint their rattles, so we were able to have a backup and actually see that those patterns didn't change over time, other than the snakes overall getting bigger. And then because of the paint on their rattle, we would be able to see in our pictures and on the videos that, you know, it's like we could match that up, and we got to do that enough times that we felt confident that the patterns don't change. So there was a way, and we have like binders full of rattlesnake drawings of what all these weird little blotches look like, so that we could tell them apart. It's trickier with some than others. The adult male Arizona blacks aren't black when they're babies. They get darker as they get older. So the older snakes, those blotches get harder and harder to see as the whole snake becomes dark. So then you're doing things like counting like yellow scales in between blotches and stuff. But yeah, usually it's a little easier than that. And it's just a matter of looking at the snakes and trying to find what differentiates them from others in an area. Some species are easier than others. I don't know how one would do it with garter snakes, for instance.
Yeah, I could imagine those dens.
Look, it's easy because we've never tried.
I mean, even when we get corns and everything, and we're trying to keep them separate, I'm like, all of you look the same to me. Like, you know, not all, but like all the ones that popped up, saying, like, oh, okay, I'm trying to and we've like accidentally almost like packaged one away to sell the wrong one. Yeah, the head pattern. But if you're just looking at the bodies, nothing's keeping them separate from me.
You've got to look for that most distinctive part, and that's we really tried to be very rigorous about that. And so every time that we saw them, we would, we'd have like, here's this photo that's the ID that gives it away, and And it is like, you can see this feature. And we really didn't have that many instances where it was like, okay, we got it down to these 2 or these 3. Like it was either you got the money shot where it was like, that's this guy, or
no idea.
Or like it could be anyone, like you just didn't get anything on it. So
yeah, but we were real conservative about it. We always, before we said it's this snake, tried to make sure like so Alice, I've mentioned before, was one of the first. She was one of the grandmother snakes. The next year, there was another big, like an old female, so a big dark female, and she eventually became TWA, which stood for the wrong Alice, because someone else that went out with us was like, oh, hey, look, it's Alice again. And then after like we started like in our rigorous way of like, counting the blotches and looking at the patterns, we're like, no, it wasn't Alice. And there was a Alice in Wonderland movie that came out then, and somebody, the rabbit or someone, kept talking about the wrong Alice. So she became the wrong Alice. And it was for that reason. It's like she superficially like kind of looked like Alice, but like once you like really stared at her and the blotches and the number of rattles and all these things, it's like, nope, that's the wrong Alice.
Okay, unrelated snake question, but because of what you do and you have to be so observant about little things, does it make you observant about other things out in the world? Like when,
or you just don't give a shit about anything?
Or is it like after you spend so much brain power like looking for one little difference, you're like, all you humans look the same? Or is it like you're super observant?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that is interesting.
I mean, so we've tried to the house where we live now, we have lizards out in our yard and that come in and out of our attached greenhouse. And we're trying to do that with them now as well. Especially ones like alligator lizards that have bands, like see if we can identify those. But and they're actually like, they're so easy. The alligator lizards are, the other ones, no. But the alligator lizards are. I don't think so. I feel like that energy is very much focused on them, and I don't want to see all those differences in people. I never thought about it before.
But no, in people, I would say no. I mean, you actually, that's a very astute observation that you made. Like we spent so much time just like clicking through, like thousands of photos. Like I gotta match this guy, and then like you're going and just days and days and days. And like we're not that rigorous about it anymore because we're not taking the same data that we were. But I think I actually do, when I'm looking at animals, I actually am like, hey, look at that sort of irregularity. Like, oh, that would be a good way to do this. Like suddenly, everything becomes a nail when you've got the hammer in your hand. So yes, and it is very difficult with a lot of things, but there are some like lizards where you're like, oh, I could see this part isn't connected on this one, but it is on this guy. So you can begin to just differentiate individuals based on sight, and it's possible, I think, to do for a lot more things than we allow.
Yeah.
But it just takes, and digital, artificial intelligence is going to be able to do this pretty soon. If it's not already being done with animals, it probably is.
It is being done with some animals.
So it's a thing that will be, I think, commonly used in the field more with owls. I just reviewed a paper where they were doing that with a horseshoe snake or something. I probably am not supposed to talk about this, but so
snake.
And it's actually not AI, but it is a digital, matching kind of a thing. And so, it's going to be a little easier. Snakes are hard because they're such, shapeshifters in the field. Like, in one photo it's a little bun, and in another photo it's a stick. Like you have to train the computer to be able to understand that these things are, very flexible and moving around, and their outward appearance based on the angle and the way that the snake is stretched and turned, that these patterns can change very much. But I think it will be more feasible in the future to be able to do that kind of study. And so that's actually a lot of what we're doing now, is like, we're just getting the footage. Who knows with climate change how long these places are going to last. there's fires that it could sweep through. So we're kind of in this like just document, and like we can't keep up with identifying snakes and marking individuals, and right now we're just kind of like, there's cool stuff going on. Let's get out there and like get the footage, and we'll just kind of sort through it later.
How do you feel about like the future of, I mean, it seems like we are still very basic in our knowledge of snakes. I mean, are you excited to see what happens in the future? I mean, is there a group of people taking this on in the scientific community and finding out more and more stuff?
I think so. It's been kind of neat since we started doing, when we like, I'm thinking back, talking about the pattern identification and how difficult and stuff that seems. And I remember when we first heard about that, and it's just like, that's impossible. There's no way. And, until this guy like went through his procedure with me, and it's just like, oh, wow, no, this isn't just like, it's blue. So, it's whoever. Like, there was a way that we're starting to see that pop up more and more. In some of the other methodologies as well. And, I think it's a combination of, having that open mind to sort of think like, what if they are doing this though? And so let's actually look for that. But then also technology that enables us to see some of these things. So I think it is slowly getting out there. So there's this happened a few years ago in the US at the scientific herp meetings in New Orleans, 16 or 17, I forget, but there was a symposium on reptile social behavior. And, and it was kind of interesting that the host of that symposium, the guy who organized it, Gordon Burghardt, had also organized one 20 years earlier. 20? Or 25? I think it was 25. I thought he said it was 25. Anyways, okay. It had been a while, and he actually kind of mentioned that in some ways, it hadn't changed that much. And it was kind of a disappointment that there were a few examples of like, this is radically different than the way people were looking at it and talking about it before. But for the most part, it hadn't changed. And what had been missing from that symposium because of some travel snafus was there's a ton of really cool work that's been done with this group of skinks, Egernia skinks that live in Australia and some other places close to that, who have these just like crazy complex social behaviors. Family groups that stay in a single rock pile and are there for generations forever. Nobody ever leaves. Like that is their tight spot. Genetic and behavioral monogamy for life with sleepy lizards. Like people think of birds as like, oh, they mate for life and they come back. Birds cheat on each other all the time. They are big time cheaters. But these lizards, like they're serious. I mean, they split up and they do, I think, in the winter, but they come back together every summer and stick together as long as the other one is alive, like forever. It's really rare. This is actually the rare behavior among animals. Yeah, and the animals and humans included. And all kinds of other stuff too, like cooperative hunting, building these like complex like tunnel system homes, because some of them live underground, that they build together and maintain together. And they're also families, like just this stuff that no one would have thought that reptiles of any kind were capable of. And all of this has been, discovered in the last 15, 20 years. And that's, that is radically changed. And I think that the more people learn about that, because that's still, getting out there outside of like Australia. I remember reading about it and being like, what? Like no one has looked at that stuff in animals in this part of the world. That gives other people ideas to study stuff. And so like, we've seen studies pop up, and I'm not trying to take credit for this, but other people using cameras to look at different aspects of snake and other reptile behavior, people using the patterns to identify animals in situations where they just like can't catch them. So it's really cool to see all that out there, because I think that enables us to look at things that we weren't able to before, that you can't see when you're just catching everything and handling everything, or, doing radio telemetry like limits the number of animals you can look at versus this site-based stuff that we've done where we're just focusing on an area and just, you know, whoever happens to show up becomes part of the study.
And the wet blanket of your advisor saying like, they're not doing that. You're not going to study that. So now that there's like the door is open a little bit and people are seeing these things, there are publications, there are videos, there are people reporting social behavior and you know, parental care, things that were poo-pooed in the past or dismissed easily. That stuff's out there a little more. So no, yeah, we're seeing people that are inspired. I mean, this is the exciting stuff. This is why people get into studying animals, because they love them, right? Like, you know, like I want to study these kinds of things because they excite me, you know, like not that many people that love animals are like, man, I really want to spend my years in a genetics lab, you know, that, you know, it's sort of that's a different pathway. Yeah. But for the people that love the animals, like there is inspiration to look at this stuff, and we are, you know, developing the tools and the technology that this stuff will really, I think, we'll be seeing more and more of these things around the world, and that I hope, you know, that's the case as well.
So it seems like obviously you can get a decent sample size. You have dens, you have communal animals. How do we figure out the behaviors of our solitary animal? You know, species, how the hell are we ever going to figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly more challenging. But, you know, it seems like there are sites that even animals that are solitary that multiple animals will use. And you're not going to get the sample sizes that you are when you can find one of those communal sites. But it's been kind of interesting. It's like a good log to hunt at is a good log to hunt at or shed for, you know, several different species of snakes. And, you know, and a lot of it's just being patient and, you know, and taking the time to observe, to like see this stuff happen. And, you know, just, you know, totally like hands off with solitary animals. You're not going to get, you know, sample sizes to put something in nature or whatever. I mean, we aren't either. But you can see cool stuff by just being patient. And if that's your goal, is just to see something neat happen. I mean, when we have seen predation events like those, that is not at those communal sites. One time it was, but for the most part, it's not. So, you know, that's just about looking around and being patient. If there's a dead rodent or lizard that seems like he's in an odd place, why is, you know, wild animals don't just collapse and die of a heart attack generally. And so maybe just like sit down a distance away and like keep an eye on that just in case somebody shows up. That seems like such a crapshoot, but I think most people like see that and they're like, nah, there's no way I could get that lucky. And so they just go. But actually it turns out that you get to see a tiger rattlesnake come along and eat that little guy or a rock rattlesnake or whoever it is. So
yeah, I think, I don't know, when you're out herping, kind of the coolest stuff you see is when you get lucky, because you see the stuff you're not looking for, I guess. But what were you going to say?
A little bit ago, you talked about pathways, and I've been wanting to talk about this for the whole 2 hours. Okay, so your major in college was in, I have it up. Shoot, no, I can't remember it. It is in wildlife, watershed, and rangeland resources. What all does that encompass? Like, what do people who get that major typically do?
So I think I think most people in that program, because it was real management. So I think that's mainly geared towards people who go into like working at your state Fish and Wildlife Agency or other like management things. So they're managing wildlife populations, they're managing land and other resources. It was kind of a catch-all for that sort of like hands-on stuff. And to be perfectly honest, when I was looking at different programs, I was kind of had been pushed. I'd gotten some influence early on from someone who their career at the time was doing environmental education, which I was back then, this was in high school, like really interested in it as well. Like that seemed like fun to work in a nature center and get to talk to people. And So he had kind of like told me that it's like, yeah, trying to find stuff in degrees and programs with management in the name versus like a zoology or biology or even an ecology degree. A lot of times that encompasses more sort of hands-on and like doing things outside versus a biology or ecology program that you might get more of that like genetics or other lab stuff. So that was part of it. The other part of it was when I transferred to the University of Arizona, if I had been in the ecology program, I would have had to take organic chemistry, and I really didn't want to. And the classes in the resource management program were a lot more fun. It was like not just mammalogy, but it was something more broad that incorporated more of like a conservation stuff. So often the conservation stuff is more with that, but I think it changes. I think it's changed a lot too, because these are, kind of constantly evolving, but it's sort of, I think if you're thinking about what you want to do and where you want to go, talking to people who are in the program, other students and professors, because I think the names aside, like they have very different cultures, like at different universities and changing over time. And, if you're wanting to do more outside stuff versus lab stuff, and it's not, I have my own preference of where I'd like to be. Labs are cold and you have to wear shoes. So not for me. But, for a lot of people, like that's what they like. And they just want to do their like herping outside stuff on the weekend and not have it be part of their job, which I can totally get that too. But yeah, I don't know. College is an interesting thing. Grad school, even more so with like the degree names and program names, like definitely having a relationship with what you're doing, but not as much as who you're working with and just sort of the flavor of what that means at that school and that place and time. Because yeah, I don't know shit about managing a watershed. That was just like, that was the very broad. And that was like, if you wanted to do wildlife biology and work in the field, that was the program that you're in. And I think like somewhere down the line, what would not fit on my resume or on the website, it does say like concentration in wildlife, but it is seriously like that degree title is so long. It never fits in a box when I have to put it in one.
So basically, you both just wanted to find a way to be in the field as much as possible.
So I wanted it to amount to something for the snakes to be, to have a conservation angle, and yeah, like the field work is awesome. That's really where, it's kind of what I grew up doing and how I fell in love with the animals is like you get to go to these cool places and see these cool animals. So I definitely wanted that to be part of it. And there's, and like Melissa said, there's a lot of directions you can go there. And so, but I wanted conservation to be part of it. And so that was the track that I was on, was sort of like, looking at the effects of urbanization or fire or, just land use in general on populations of herps or endangered animals, species of concern. And that's what a ton of people are doing as far as herp conservation, and it's valuable. We need that information, but this twist that we've taken, where it was like, oh, suddenly like behavior is really interesting, and it can have this outlet for conservation by getting people to like understand snakes a little more, just from on a personal gut level. Like that's something that no one would have ever said is a thing. Like you can't, you can't study snakes, and behavior in conservation with that application is not really that common. So, and I think it's, in this case, it's sort of unique to the creepy crawly animals. Like, you have other people that study coyotes and bats and sharks and these loathed animals, but it's like, hey, we need to study them and show people that they've got other things going on. They've got other aspects that are just under considered.
Yeah. But nobody needs to do that with birds. Like everybody likes them anyway.
Yeah.
People like them. Yeah. Yeah. And and in some ways, I think that was my driving force, like in school for a very long time was, how do I stay outside doing fun stuff and, get a job? But But yeah, now to be honest, this turn that we've taken with this focus on education, the field work is very much a supplement to that. It's like we need that material, and we can't just continue telling the same stories forever and ever, because it's not like we're traveling the world telling them. It's kind of the same audiences, so we need new stuff. But that's a pretty small part of what we do now. It's like, yeah, we do still get to go outside. We've moved to southwestern New Mexico so that we could just be out in our own backyard and get to see cool stuff. But as far as like what we do to further snake conservation, most of that's done, you know, talking to an audience, being at a table somewhere, giving a presentation, you know, watching, so much at the computer. Like, I don't want to list that first, but honestly, like, yeah, most of it's that, unfortunately. You know, for us, because it's more fun to be outside, but I also get really like jazzed and excited when I get to share that information with people, because it's, you know, because we care about these animals. And so getting to see, you know, minds change, like as you're talking to them, let alone when people tell you you've had that impact, it's like, that's also really exciting. As exciting as having a mommy rattlesnake chase from her babies, I'm not sure, but it's nice, you know, I get to tell that story, so that's fun too.
Yeah, you have the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Another thing about sort of our path and how we got here is that we're both pretty stubborn and lucky, and we both love the animals, and we didn't really want to see bad things happen to them. And when you are indoctrinated into the cult of science, I really don't. You know, I do have a respect for science and the world that it's given us, and a lot of practicing scientists I like. But there's this sort of you know, like if you're touchy-feely, if you love the animals, like, yeah, you don't really have any business here. And I think it can be a big turnoff for the people that are really poised to be very devoted and hardworking individuals that just like love this stuff with all their heart.
Get turned off.
You can get turned off when they're like, well, you know, we need to do these experiments where we cut the heads off, and like that's just how it is. That's how we do science. And like, I wouldn't have done a study like that. You know, if that was my lab, I'd be like, well, you know,
bye,
peace. I'm gonna go, you know, work at the gym down the road or whatever. So, you know, when you're on your path, if you're doing it, if you want to follow your passion and study snakes in the wild or whatever sort of animal or plant that you're interested in, you know, you can have a set of ideals, and when you're shopping around for career paths, you can have that in mind and just kind of like set your own boundaries. You know, you can kind of decide what lines you're willing to cross and which ones you're not. And, you know, when you're talking to people at schools that you might work with, and you say like, hey, is this a department where they have a barbecue every year where you have to eat the animal that you study? Because that's
a common thing.
That's a thing that people do. And you know, like, you know, when you talk about cults, like it's sort of an indoctrination into this like, you know, thou shalt not be touchy-feely. You have to be you know, and you can't regard their life very highly.
It's a specimen. Yeah. You take it in the field.
Mm-hmm.
You have to sort of deaden that sense in yourself. And so, you know, if you really love the animals, then, you know, like you might not make it very far. So, but there are people that in the field that are you know, willing to, you know, that themselves have rules in their lab about, you know, how much harm they're willing to do.
And a lot of that being successful is, it's not that, I mean, of course we think our way is the right way because that's why we're doing it this way. But, you know, a lot of it's just finding a good match. Like, you know, someone who, you know, if we were in the position of like having a lab, which we're not, but, you know, and someone came to work with us that did want to chop the heads off everybody and have that annual barbecue, it's like, that would be a poor match and they wouldn't be very successful with us. So a lot of it's like sort of finding, you know, this program that's a good fit and these people that are a good fit, and other stuff they do. And it's a lot of, you know, I thought that I did talk to people and ask a lot of questions and did a good job of that. And there were still, without getting into specifics, like some not great matches. You can't do that too much, and you can't, I feel like now I can't emphasize that enough to younger people that I'm talking to about, how to figure this out and get where you want to go. It's just like, yeah, so many questions and so much talking to people. Because there's a lot of different ways to do this, and herpetology or biology or studying snakes can take so many different forms. And even within conservation, conservation genetics versus what we do, which is a lot of education, versus like that active management of figuring out how they respond to fire. It's just, they're just wildly different. And it's just, we need people doing, maybe not the cutting off heads, but most of the other things, like we need people doing all these different things, and it's just sort of figuring out what it is that you're interested in and good at, and that you're going to get inspired about. And so therefore you'll do a better job of it, and finding a place to figure all that out.
Absolutely. Now we blew past that 2 hours very quickly, I feel.
Yeah, my body couldn't handle it. I had to bail.
One last question. So between ASP or just your careers in general, I mean, what is a goal that you have, an impact you want to make on whether it's the world as a whole or just the people who are interested in snakes? I mean, what's really the goal that you want to have?
I could give you the vision statement of the organization, but I'm not going to. I'm actually going to be very specific about it. I would like the default for when a venomous snake shows up in someone's backyard. I would like the default to be, wow, this is neat. I want to see what he does, instead of how do we get rid of him? Like that's the impact that I would like to have personally and as our organization, just to change that very simple reaction. And that feels very big and lofty.
It's so concise in a sense, but also so hard to attain.
Yeah.
Like,
bizarro world.
Yeah, right. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think similarly. It's just more broadly. It's treat these animals with curiosity. The fear is so undeserved, and 99% of the time, humans are interacting with snakes that not like you're in the pet store or whatever, but when you're in the wild, people are just consumed with irrationality about it, and so. But most of the time, like for me to see a snake in the wild, it's like, oh my God, I'm lucky. Like let's milk everything we can out of this experience. Like stick with it and get photos or just kind of see what it does. Come back tomorrow and see if it's still there. Like I think if people could see past their own fear, just to break through to where it's not like I'm not in a mortally compromising situation here. That it's just like they're so cool. They're scared and they're interesting and they're doing their thing, and like they're so foreign. And we have aliens right here on Earth, and like we can try to understand. And it's just like, I don't know. I mean, I could spend hours and hours and hours just watching these things in the field and trying to get a sense of what it is they're doing. What's behind them, what motivates them, and so just to like get people to step, take a step aside and be able to look at things that way would be, I think, so life-changing for people to just, get through that fear.
And if anyone wants to get in touch with you guys or check out what you're working on, where can they do so?
So we have a website. It's at snakes.ngo, like non-governmental organization. And then we're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram as well. If you search on any of those for advocates for snake preservation, you should be able to find us. And we have some videos on YouTube as well. That's something we need to put more on there. But yeah, on the big ones. No Snapchat.
We aren't on well, our business isn't on Snapchat either.
Yeah.
But please, interact. I mean, it's so cool to have people get on there and comment and share and
yeah, I love hearing about their stories. We tweet out some picture or video of some cool thing we saw that we thought was like rare or weird or whatever, and someone else, like chimes in with something they saw. Like, yeah, I mean, that's so cool. Or shares a picture. Like that stuff is just, amazing. I mean, for no other reason, like we're pretty limited to, we've been doing this work just in the southwestern US and mainly just in Arizona. So it's so cool to hear about, all the species of snakes in the rest of the US and the rest of the world doing neat stuff too, and other reptiles as well.
Absolutely. So everyone go check them out wherever.
Whatever social media you choose.
Besides Snapchat.
Sorry, yes.
You weirdos. I don't know who would snap us
But I don't want Snapchat for a business. I'm okay with that.
Interesting.
Yeah. But if people want to reach out to us, obviously we're on YouTube right now. You can find us at Port City Pythons on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. We don't have a Twitter. But it's just
yes, we do. You just don't. You just don't know about it.
We don't use our Twitter.
I use it, but okay.
When do you?
I don't actually say anything.
Thank
I just
you.
share things from Instagram. I'll be honest.
Okay. Twitter that's the last one. Also,
it's a tough one.
You can check us out on portcitypythons.com or email us at theportcitypythons@gmail.com.
Orient Center for Indigo Conservation shirts fundraiser. I would love if you would buy one. Money goes obviously to the OCIC, and it will go towards building basically outdoor facilities for their animals in which they breed and then re-release. So please check that out. Please check out our episode with Michelle. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you guys all for coming. And thank you, of course, to Melissa and Jeff for hanging out with us. And you guys have a great night.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.
We will. Which one? Am I doing the right one?
No, it is this one. The bottom one. Sorry.
I don't know my buttons.